Believe it or not, this is Skyrim. The game is infamous for having so many ports, remasters, and editions that we all own at least 3 copies of it at this point. But in the nearly 15 years since it was released, it isn't Bethesda's increasingly galling cash grabs keeping Skyrim alive, it's modders. And the same can be said for all the most iconic games in Bethesda's catalog. But before we get into the not-so-symbiotic relationship between Bethesda and its modding community, we'd really appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what we put out next. Bethesda Softworks has existed since 1986 when communications engineer Christopher Weaver partnered with fellow tech nerd Ed Fletcher to create the football simulation game Gridiron. But the company wouldn't really start to shape itself into the megacorp we know today until 1994 with the release of The Elder Scrolls Arena. A bold and experimental entry into early CRPGs, Arena and its 1996 sequel Daggerfall would go on to become icons of the genre. They introduced a generation of players to the continent of Tamriel, a sprawling landscape encompassing 9 unique provinces teeming with, well, honestly, pretty much the same stuff. While a tiny team of developers did their best, the real diversity of the land wouldn't come until later in the series. Make no mistake though, these games were still ambitious. Thanks to the wonders of procedurally generated maps, they were massive. They were stuffed full of magic, monsters, and adventure. And they were buggy as hell. But most importantly, they laid the groundwork for what the series could be and helped plot the course for Bethesda's trajectory as a company for decades to come. From 2002's Morrowind to 2011 Skyrim, the Elder Scrolls series became the name in fantasy RPGs. Meanwhile, the Fallout franchise earned itself just as much of a foothold in the post-apocalyptic sci-fi niche, and people did what they always do with games they love. They modded them into oblivion. And sometimes they literally modded the Elder Scrolls Oblivion. The Gamebryo engine and later the Creation engine are uniquely easy for tech-savvy players to access and mod, even back in the early days of Morrowind and Fallout 3. And games like Skyrim eventually got their own dedicated modding kits put out by Bethesda. This allowed for more streamlined use, making mods simpler to put together and thus more plentiful online. Everything from cosmetic armor mods, to graphical upgrades, to fully voiced companions and entire games within games have been created from these tools, all for free. And every time it looks as though the modding community has reached its apex, some new team of talented creatives find a new peak to climb. Now, it should be mentioned that this kind of enthusiastic mod support from a developer isn't typical. Offering full modding tools to players the way Bethesda does isn't unheard of, but it is notable. Many game companies would be scandalized by the idea of, say, something like Fallout London, the entirely fan-made mod that's basically just DLC for Fallout 4, complete with new enemies, new characters, new abilities, and a whole lot more. Now, if this was a Nintendo or EA property, you better believe they'd shut that down for fear of fans confusing a mod for the real deal. In fact, that very thing has happened multiple times. Then there's the fan remakes, projects like Skyblivion, which is a remaster of the Elder Scrolls Oblivion rendered on Skyrim's engine. It could be seen as a direct encroachment of Bethesda's IP and potential revenue, especially considering the company recently published an actual remaster of that same game. So what did Bethesda do? They flew the Skyblivion team out to tour the Bethesda headquarters and gave them all free copies of the Oblivion remaster. That's really commendable behavior. It deserves to be highlighted, and it's one of the reasons, besides just making good games, that Bethesda has earned its credentials as a legendary AAA developer. Like so many of their games' protagonists, Bethesda was special, chosen. But legends, as it turns out, don't always have a happy ending. And the chosen one doesn't always fulfill their fated purpose.
76, our future begins.
Over the years, opinions on Bethesda have soured significantly for a variety of reasons. Arguably, discourse started heating up all the way back in 2015 with the launch of Fallout 4, which some fans saw as a step down in terms of gameplay, narrative complexity, and technical stability. And it also happens to be one of the only 2 Fallout games that Bethesda actually developed rather than simply published. Similar complaints have been levied, mostly in hindsight, at Skyrim. While it remains one of the greatest games of all time for many, some longtime players of the Elder Scrolls series were less than thrilled with Skyrim's smoothed-down magic and combat systems, the easy dungeons, the uselessness of speechcraft, the more basic story, and of course, the bugs. Fans hoped these issues would be rectified in the next installment, which still hasn't arrived more than a decade later. As we approach the end of the 2010s, the company really only had the now floundering Fallout and the stagnant Elder Scrolls to its name. Clearly, something had to be done. That something turned out to be the disastrous launch of the multiplayer Fallout 76 and Starfield. While Fallout 76 has since been able to redeem itself in the minds of players, Starfield has not been so lucky. This was Bethesda's first new IP in 25 years, a fact they misguidedly boast about on the game's Steam page. When it was released back in 2023, it was plagued with all the same issues as previous titles. Streamlined systems, a lackluster narrative, bugs, and the graphics were frankly outdated for a modern AAA title. It all added up to an underwhelming launch, and it became clear that the company had stagnated. The tiny dev team that once had been at the forefront of CRPG experimentation was now falling behind the curve, and they didn't even seem to care. So most people just went back to the old Bethesda games they actually liked, turning, as always, to mods to fill the content gaps. And as for the rest of Bethesda's library, well, many of the games and franchises people associated with Bethesda, Doom, Dishonored, Quake, Wolfenstein, and the like, weren't developed by them. They were just the publisher. As it turns out, Bethesda's track record as a developer isn't exactly stellar. The games they develop don't just support mods. For huge chunks of players, they basically require them. And this is where things get dicey. Bethesda knows it owes much of its success to the modding community. They've even hired some of them. In an interview with IGN for Skyrim's 10-year anniversary, game director Todd Howard said,
"When you think about the legacy of our games, one of the reasons we're sitting here 10 years later is because of our modding community."
That acknowledgement is appreciated, to be sure, but it doesn't put the full scope of the modding community's impact into focus. While we've talked about all the incredible mods that add content to Bethesda's games or create brand new games built off their bones, we haven't talked much about the mods dedicated to fixing bugs or generally improving the quality of life of players. There are countless unofficial patches out there from modders which address long-standing issues Bethesda is either unwilling or unable to take care of themselves. And let's be honest, at this point, why would they take care of it themselves when they know the modders will do it for them? Why put effort into polishing the game at all? They have bigger, more profitable things to contend with. Nowhere is that more glaring than in the recent Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition, which was completely broken on launch. And what was the first thing Bethesda decided to fix? Not the actual in-game issues, but the storefront where you can buy individual creations, aka mods, made by modders in partnership with Bethesda. These things are purchased with real money, and while the creators are paid for their contributions, doesn't it all seem a bit shady? This isn't new either. Skyrim's Creation Club was unveiled back in 2017, and the version found in Fallout 4's Anniversary Edition is just as, if not more, scummy than ever. These creations are effectively microtransactions masquerading as collaborations with the modding community. The PR spin is that talented modders get to be recognized in an official capacity and paid for their work, which is admirable. But the reality is that Bethesda contracts these people out so they can profit off their work, which might have otherwise been free on Nexus mods. Many popular mod authors are supported through Patreon or other donation-based platforms, bypassing Bethesda altogether. And in our humble opinion, that's really the best possible way for modders to get their bag. At the end of the day, despite Bethesda's admittedly broad-minded views of mods and the surrounding community, they are still a company. And companies don't care about you. They're going to find ways to exploit your passion and creativity in order to make as much money and do as little work as possible, and that certainly seems to be what's going on with Bethesda. For literal decades, the fans of these games have been volunteering their time and creative energy to bettering the fictional worlds they fell in love with. And they pushed the boundaries of what was even thought possible within the restrictions of these now archaic game engines, more so than the actual game developers did. There's a magic to that can-do attitude that hasn't really been replicated in any other fandom, and it's why a lot of us love these games. According to Bethesda's former marketing executive Pete Hines, Todd Howard once said, "Great games are played, not made." But maybe, in this case, great games are modded, not made. And well, that's all we've got for you today. What's your opinion on Bethesda's relationship with its modding community? Let us know in the comments, and while you're here, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what we put out next time.